Malu, describing them to Obens, would say that Kimberly gave the impression of a tiny bird with fine bones, easily crushed, while Laura brought to mind a hawk, sharp-beaked and dark-minded. Hello, I'm Malu. What a beautiful name, Kimberly said. Does it mean anything? I love multicultural names because they have such wonderful meanings, from wonderful rich cultures. Kimberly was smiling the kindly smile of people who thought, culture, the unfamiliar colorful reserve of colorful people, a word that always had to be qualified with, rich. She would not think Norway had a rich culture. I don't know what it means, Malu said, and sensed rather than saw a small amusement on Ginnika's face. Would you like some tea? Kimberly asked, leading the way into a kitchen of shiny chrome and granite in a fluent empty space. We're tea drinkers, but of course there are other choices. Tea is great, Ginnika said. And you, Malu? Kimberly asked. I know I'm mauling your name, but it really is such a beautiful name. Really beautiful. No, you said it properly. I'd like some water or orange juice, please. Malu would come to realize later that Kimberly used beautiful in a peculiar way. I'm meeting my beautiful friend from graduate school, Kimberly would say, or, we're working with this beautiful woman on the inner city project, and always, the women she referred to would turn out to be quite ordinary looking, but always black. One day, late that winter, when she was with Kimberly at the huge kitchen table, drinking tea and waiting for the children to be brought back from an outing with their grandmother, Kimberly said, "Oh, look at this beautiful woman," and pointed at a plain model in a magazine whose only distinguishing feature was can just say, black. Not every black person is beautiful. Kimberly was taken aback. Something wordless spread on her face and then she smiled, and Malu would think of it as the moment they became, truly, friends. But on that first day, she liked Kimberly, her breakable beauty, her purplish eyes full of the expression Obens often used to describe the people he liked, Obiocha. A clean heart. Kimberly asked Malu questions about her parents with children, listening carefully as though what she wanted to hear was what might be left unsaid. She doesn't have CPR certification, Kim, Laura said. She turned to Malu. Are you willing to take the course? It's very important if you are going to have children in your care. I'm willing to. Ginnika said you left Nigeria because college professors are always on strike there. Kimberly asked. Yes. Laura nodded knowingly. Horrible. What's going on in African countries? How are you finding the US so far? Kimberly asked. Malu told her about the vertigo she had felt the first time she went to the supermarket. In the cereal aisle, she had wanted to get cornflakes, which she was used to eating back home, but suddenly confronted by 100 different cereal boxes, in a swirl of colors and images, she had fought dizziness. She told this story because she thought it was funny. It appealed harmlessly to the American ego. Laura laughed. I can see how you'd be dizzy. Yes, we're really about excess in this country, Kimberly said. I'm sure back home you ate a lot of wonderful organic food and vegetables, but you're going to see it's different here. Kim, if she was eating all of this wonderful organic food in Nigeria, why would she come to the US? Laura asked. As children, Laura must have played the role of the big sister who exposed the stupidity of the little sister, always with kindness and good cheer, and preferably in the company of adult relatives. Well, even if they had very little food, I'm just saying it was probably all organic vegetables, none of the frankenfood we have here, Kimberly said. Malu sensed, between them, the presence of spiky thorns floating in the air. You haven't told her about television, Laura said. She turned to Malu. Kim's kids do supervised TV, only PBS. So if she hired you, you would need to be completely present and monitor what goes on, especially with Morgan. Okay, I don't have a babysitter, Laura said, her eye glowing with righteous emphasis. I'm a full-time, hands-on mom. I thought I would return to work when Athena turned 2, but I just couldn't bear to let her go. Kim is really hands-on, too, but shish. Busy sometimes, she does wonderful work with her charity, and so I'm always worried about the babysitters. The last one, Martha, was wonderful, but we did wonder whether the one before her, what was her name again, let Morgan watch inappropriate shows. I don't do any television at all with my daughter. I think there's too much violence. I might let her do a few cartoons when she's a little older. But there's violence in cartoons, too, Malu said. Laura looked annoyed. It's cartoon. Kids are traumatized by the real thing. Ginnika glanced at Malu, a knitted brow look that said, just leave it alone. In primary school, Malu had watched the firing squad that killed Lawrence Anini, fascinated by the mythologies around his armed robberies, how he wrote warning letters to newspapers, fed the poor with what he stole, turned himself into air when the police came. Her mother had said, go inside, this is not for children, but half-heartedly, after Malu had already seen most of the shooting anyway, Anini's body roughly tied to a pole, jerking as the bullets hit him, before slumping against the crisscross of rope. She thought about this now, how haunting and yet how ordinary it had seemed. Let me show you the house, Malu, Kimberly said. Did I say it right? They walked from room to room, the daughter's room with pink walls and a frilly bed cover, the son's room with a set of drums, the den with a piano, its polished wooden top crowded with family photographs. We took that in India, Kimberly said. They were standing by an empty rickshaw, wearing T-shirts, Kimberly with her golden hair tied back, her tall and lean husband, her small blonde son and older red-haired daughter, all holding water bottles and smiling. They were always smiling in the photos they took, while sailing and hiking and visiting tourist spots, holding each other, all easy limbs and white teeth. They reminded Ike Malou of television commercials, of people whose lives were lived always in flattering light, whose messes were still aesthetically pleasing. Some of the people we met had nothing, absolutely nothing, but they were so happy, Kimberly said. She extracted a photograph from the crowded back of the piano, of her daughter with two Indian women. Hair skin dark and weathered, their smiles showing missing teeth. These women were so wonderful, she said. Ike Malou would also come to learn that, for Kimberly, the poor were blameless. Poverty was a gleaming thing. She could not conceive of poor people being vicious or nasty because their poverty had canonized them, and the greatest saints were the poor and poor. Morgan loves that. It's Native American. But Taylor says it's scary. Kimberly pointed to a small piece of sculpture amid the photographs. Oh, Ike Malou suddenly did not remember which was the boy and which the girl. Both names, Morgan and Taylor, sounded to her like surnames. Kimberly's husband came home just before Ike Malou left. Hello, hello, he said, gliding into the kitchen, tall and tanned and tactical. Ike Malou could tell, from the longish length, the near-perfect waves that grazed his collar, that he took fastidious care of his hair. You must be Ginika's friend from Nigeria, he said, smiling, brimming with his awareness of his own charm. He looked people in the eye not because he was interested in them but because he knew it made them feel that he was interested in them. With his appearance, Kimberly became slightly breathless. Her voice changed. She spoke now in the high-pitched voice of the self-consciously female. Dawn, honey, you're early, she said as they kissed. Dawn looked into Ike Malou's eyes and told her how he had nearly visited Nigeria, just after Shigari was elected, when he worked as a consultant to an international development agency, but the trip fell through at the last minute and he had felt bad because he had been hoping to go to the shrine and see Fela perform. He mentioned Fela casually, intimately, as though it was something they had in common, a secret they shared. There was, in his storytelling, an expectation of successful seduction. Ike Malou stared at him, saying little, refusing to be ensnared, and feeling strangely sorry for Kimberly. To be saddled with a sister like Laura and a husband like this. Dawn and I are involved with a really good charity in Malawi. Actually, Dawn is much more involved than I am. Kimberly looked at Dawn, who made a wry face and said, well, we do our best but we know very well that we're not messiahs. We should plan a trip to visit. It's an orphanage. We've never been to Africa. I would love to do something with my charity in Africa. Kimberly's face had softened, her eyes misted over, and for a moment Ike Malou was sorry to have come from Africa, to be the reason that this beautiful woman, with her bleached teeth and bounteous hair, would have to dig deep to feel such pity, such hopelessness. She smiled brightly, hoping to make Kimberly feel better. I'm interviewing one more person and then I'll let you know, but I really think you're a great fit for us, Kimberly said, leading Ike Malou and Ginika to the front door. Thank you, Ike Malou said. I would love to work for you. The next day, Ginika called and left a message, her tone low. Ifem, I'm so sorry. Kimberly hired somebody else but she said she'll keep you in mind. Something will work out soon, don't worry too much. I'll call later. Ike Malou wanted to fling the phone away. Keep her in mind. Why would Ginika even repeat such an empty expression, keep her in mind? It was late autumn, the trees had grown antlers, dried leaves were sometimes trailed into the apartment, and the rent was due. Her roommate's checks were on the kitchen table, one on top of the other, all of them pink and bordered by flowers. She thought it unnecessarily decorative, to have flowered checks in America, it almost took away from the seriousness of a check. Beside the checks was a note, in Jackie's childish writing, Ike Malou, we're almost a week late for rent. Writing a check would leave her account empty. Her mother had given her a small jar of mentholatum the day before she left Lagos, saying, put this in your bag, for when you will be cold. She rummaged now in her suitcase for it, opened and sniffed it, rubbing some under her nose. The scent made her want to weep. The answering machine was blinking but she did not check it because it would be yet another variation of Auntie Uju's message. Has anyone called you back? Have you tried the nearby McDonald's and Burger King? They don't always advertise but they might be hiring. I can't send you anything until next month. My own account is empty. Honestly, to be a resident doctor is slave labor. Newspapers were strewn on the floor, Job Lee. Tings circled in ink. She picked one up and flipped through, looking at advertisements she had already seen. Escorts caught her eye again. Ginika had said to her, forget that escort thing. They say it isn't prostitution but it isn't. The worst thing is that you get maybe a quarter of what you earn because the agency takes the rest. I know this girl who did it in freshman year. Ike Malou read the advertisement and thought, again, of calling, but she didn't, because she was hoping that the last interview she went for, a waitress position in a little restaurant that didn't pay a salary, only tips, would come through. They had said they would call her by the end of the day if she got the job. She waited until very late but they did not call. And then Alina's dog ate her bacon. She had heated up a slice of bacon on a paper towel, put it on the table, and turned to open the fridge. The dog swallowed the bacon in the paper towel. She stared at the empty space where her bacon had been, and then she stared at the dog, its expression smug, and all the frustrations of her life boiled up in her head. A dog eating her bacon while she was jobless. Your dog just ate my bacon, she told Elena, who was slicing a banana at the other end of the kitchen, the pieces falling into her cereal bowl. You just hate my dog. You should train him better. He shouldn't eat people's food from the kitchen table. You better not kill my dog with voodoo. What? Just kidding, Elena said. Elena was smirking, her dog's tail wagging, and Ifmalu felt acid in her veins. She moved towards Elena, hand raised and ready to explode on Elena's face, before she caught herself with a jolt, stopped and turned and went upstairs. She sat on her bed and hugged her knees to her chest, shaken by her own reaction, how quickly her fury had risen. Downstairs, Elena was screaming on the phone. I swear to God, bitch just tried to hit me. Ifmalu had wanted to slap her dissolute roommate not because a slobbering dog had eaten her bacon but because she was at war with the world, and woke up each day feeling bruised, imagining a horde of faceless people who were all against her. It terrified her, to be unable to visualize tomorrow. When her parents called, ND left a voice message. She saved it, unsure if that would be the last time she would hear their voices. To be here, living abroad, not knowing when she could go home again, was to watch love become anxiety. If she called her mother's friend Auntie Bunmi and the phone rang to the end, with no answer, she panicked, worried that perhaps her father had died and Auntie Bunmi did not know how to tell her. Later, Allison knocked on her door. Ifmalu, just wanted to remind you, your rent check isn't on the table. We're already really late. I know. I'm writing it. She lay face up on her bed. She didn't want to be the roommate who had rent problems. She hated that Ginika had bought her groceries last week. She could hear Jackie's raised voice from downstairs. What are we supposed to do? We're not her fucking parents. She brought out her checkbook. Before she wrote the check, she called Auntie Uju to speak to Dyke. Then, refreshed by his innocence, she called the tennis coach in Ardmore. When can I start working? She asked. Want to come over right now? Okay, she said. She shaved her underarms, dug out the lipstick she had not worn since the day she left Lagos, most of it left smeared on Obens's neck at the airport. What would happen with the tennis coach? He had said, massage, but his manner, his tone, had drip suggestion. Perhaps he was one of those white men she had read about, with strange tastes, who wanted women to drag a feather over their back or urinate on them. She could certainly do that, urinate on a man for $100. The thought amused her, and she smiled a small wry smile. Whatever happened, she would approach it looking her best. She would make it clear to him that there were boundaries she would not cross. She would say, from the beginning, if you expect sex, then I can't help you. Or perhaps she would say it more delicately, more suggestively. I'm not comfortable going too far. She might be imagining too much. He might just want a massage. When she arrived at his house, his manner was brusque. Come on up, he said, and led the way to his bedroom, bare but for a bed and a large painting of a tomato soup can on the wall. He offered her something to drink, in a perfunctory way that sug. Teddy expected her to say no, and then he took off his shirt and lay on the bed. Was there no preface? She wished he had done things a little more slowly. Her own words had deserted her. Come over here, he said. I need to be warm. She should slowly toward the door, wondering if it was locked, if he had locked it, and then she wondered if he had a gun. Just come here and lie down, he said. Keep me warm. I'll touch you a little bit, nothing you'll be uncomfortable with. I just need some human contact to relax. There was, in his expression and tone, a complete assuredness. She felt defeated. How sordid it all was, that she was feeling heavy and slow, her mind choked with mud, and, seated by the window, she began to cry. She felt like a small ball, adrift and alone. The world was a big, big place and she was so tiny, so insignificant, rattling around emptily. Back in her apartment, she washed her hands with water so hot that it scalded her fingers, and a small soft well flowered on her thumb. She took off all her clothes, and squashed them into a rumpled ball that she threw at a corner, staring at it for a while. She would never again wear those clothes, never even touch them. She sat naked on her bed and looked at her life, in this tiny room with the moldy carpet, the $100 bill on the table, her body rising with loathing. She should never have gone there. She should have walked away. She wanted to shower, to scrub herself, but she could not bear the thought of touching her own body, and so she put on her nightdress, gingerly, to touch as little of herself as possible. Obens. She could not bear to think of him now. She thought of calling Ginika. Finally, she called Auntie Uju. I went to work for a man in the suburbs today. He paid me $100. That's very good, but you have to keep looking for something permanent. I've just realized I have to buy health insurance for Dyke because the one this new hospital in Massachusetts offers is nonsense. It does not cover him. I am still in shock by how much I have to pay. Won't you ask me what I did, Auntie? Won't you ask me what I did before the man paid me $100? Malu asked, a new anger sweeping over her, treading itself through her fingers so that they shook. What did you do? Auntie Uju asked flatly. Malu hung up. She pressed new on her machine. The first message was from her mother, speaking quickly to reduce the cost of the call. Ifam, how are you? We are calling to see how you are. We have not heard from you in a while. Please send a message. We are well. God bless you. Then Obens' voice, his words floating into the air, into her head. I love you, Ifam, he said, at the end, in that voice that seemed suddenly so far away, part of another time and place. She lay rigid on her bed. She could not sleep. She could not distract herself. She began to think about killing the tennis coach. She would hit him on the head over and over with an axe. She would plunge a knife to his muscled chest. He lived alone. He probably had other women coming to his room to spread their legs for his stubby finger with its bitten back nail. Nobody would know which of them had done it. She would leave the knife sunk in his chest and then search his drawers for his bundle of $100 bills so that she could pay her rent and her tuition. That night, it snowed, her first snow, and in the morning, she watched the world outside her window, the parked cars made lumpy, misshapen by layered snow. She was bloodless, detached, floating in a world where darkness descended too soon and everyone walked around burdened by coats, and flattened by the absence of light. The days drained into one another, crisp air turning to freezing air, painful to inhale. Obens called many times but she did not pick up her phone. She deleted his voice messages unheard and his emails unread, and she felt herself sinking quickly, and unable to pull herself up. She woke up torpid each morning, slowed by sadness, frightened by the endless stretch of day that lay ahead. Everything had thickened. She was swallowed, lost in a viscous haze, shrouded in a soup of nothingness. Between her and what she should feel, there was a gap. She cared about nothing. She wanted to care, but she no longer knew how. It had slipped from her memory, the ability to care. Sometimes she woke up flailing and helpless, and she saw, in front of her and behind her and all around her, an utter hopelessness. She knew there was no point in being here, in being alive, but she had no energy to think concretely of how she could kill herself. She lay in bed and read books and thought of nothing. Sometimes she forgot to eat and other times she waited until midnight, her roommates in their rooms, before heating up her food, and she left the dirty plates under her bed, until greenish mold fluffed up around the oily remnants of rice and beans. Often, in the middle of eating or reading, she would feel a crushing urge to cry and the tears would come, the sobs hurting her throat. She had turned off the ringer of her phone. She no longer went to class. Her days were stilled by silence and snow. Allison was banging on her door again. Are you there? Phone call. She says it's an emergency, for God's sake. I know. Over there, I heard you flush the toilet a minute ago. The flat, dull banging, as though Allison was hitting the door with an open palm rather than a knuckle, unnerved Malu. She's not opening, she heard Allison say, and then, just when she thought Allison had left, the banging resumed. She got up from her bed, where she had been lying and taking turns reading 2 novels chapter by chapter, and with leaden feet moved to the door. She wanted to walk quickly, normally, but she could not. Her feet had turned into snails. She unlocked the door. With a glare, Allison thrust the phone in her hand. Thanks, she said, limply, and added, in a lower mumble, sorry. Even talking, making words rise up her throat and out of her mouth, exhausted her. Hello, she said into the phone. Ifam, what's going on? What's happening to you? Ginika asked. Nothing, she said. I've been so worried about you. Thank God I found your roommate's number. Obens has been calling me. He's worried out of his mind, Ginika said. Even Auntie Uju called to ask if I had seen you. I've been busy, Malu said vaguely. There was a pause. Ginika's tone softened. Ifam, I'm here, you know that, right? Malu wanted to hang up and return to her bed. Yes, I have good news. Kimberly called me to ask for your phone number. The babysitter she hired just left. She wants to hire you. She wants you to start on Monday. She said she wanted you from the beginning but Laura talked her into hiring the other person. So, Ifam, you have a job. Cash. Under the table. Ifamsko, this is great. She'll pay you $250 a week, more than the old babysitter. And pure cash under the table. Kimberly is a really great person. I'm coming tomorrow to take you over there to see her. Malu said nothing, struggling to understand. Words took so long to form meaning. The next day, Ginika knocked on her door before Malu finally opened, and saw Allison standing on the landing at the back, watching curiously. We're late already, get dressed, Ginika said, firmly, authoritatively, with no room for dissent. Malu pulled on a pair of jeans. She felt Ginika watching her. In the car, Ginika's rock music filled the silence between them. Were on Lancaster Avenue, just about to cross over from West Philadelphia, with boarded-up buildings and hamburger wrappers strewn around, and into the spotless, tree-filled suburbs of the main line, when Ginika said, I think you're suffering from depression. Malu shook her head and turned to the window. Depression was what happened to Americans, with their self-absolving need to turn everything into an illness. She was not suffering from depression, she was merely a little tired and a little slow. I don't have depression, she said. Years later, she would blog about this, on the subject of non-American blacks suffering from illnesses whose names they refused to know. A Congolese woman wrote a long comment in response. She had moved to Virginia from Kinshasa and, months into her first semester of college, begun to feel dizzy in the morning, her heart pounding as though in flight from her stomach fraught with nausea, her fingers tingling. She went to see a doctor. And even though she checked, yes, to all the symptoms on the card the doctor gave her, she refused to accept the diagnosis of panic attacks because panic attacks happened only to Americans. Nobody in Kinshasa had panic attacks. It was not even that it was called by another name, it was simply not called at all. Did things begin to exist only when they were named? This is something a lot of people go through, and I know it's not been easy for you adjusting to a new place and still not having a job. We don't talk about things like depression in Nigeria, but it's real. You should see somebody at the health center. There's always therapists. Malu kept her face to the window. She felt, again, that crushing desire to cry, and she took a deep breath, hoping it would pass. She wished she had told Ginika about the tennis coach, taken the train to Ginika's apartment on that day, but now it was too late, her self-loathing had hardened inside her. She would never be able to form the sentences to tell her story. Ginika, she said, thank you. Her voice was hoarse. The tears had come, she could not control them. Ginika stopped at a gas station, gave her a tissue, and waited for her sobs to die down before she started the car and drove to Kimberly's house. Chapter 16. Kimberly called it a signing bonus. Ginika told me you've had some challenges, Kimberly said. Please don't refuse. It would not have occurred to Malu to refuse the check. Now she could pay some bills, send something home to her parents. Her mother liked the shoes she sent, tasseled and tapering, the kind she could wear to church. Thank you, her mother said, and then sighing heavily over the phone line, she added, Obens came to see me. Malu was silent. Whatever problem you have, please discuss it with him, her mother said. Malu said, okay, and began to talk about something else. When her mother said there had been no light for 2 weeks, it seemed suddenly foreign to her, and home itself a distant place. She could no longer remember what it felt like to spend an evening in candlelight. She no longer read the news on Nigeria.com because each headline, even the most unlikely ones, somehow reminded her of Obens. At first, she gave herself a month. A month to let her self-loathing seep away, then she would call Obens. But a month passed and still she kept Obens sealed in silence, gagged her own mind so that she would think of him as little as possible. She still deleted his emails unread. Many times she started to write to him, she crafted emails, and then stopped and discarded them. She would have to tell him what happened, and she could not bear the thought of telling him what happened. She felt shamed, she had failed. Ginika kept asking what was wrong, why she had shut out Obens, and she said it was nothing, she just wanted some space, and Ginika gaped at her in disbelief. You just want some space. Early in the spring, a letter arrived from Obens. Deleting his emails took a click, and after the first click, the others were easier because she could not imagine reading the second if she had not read the first. But a letter was different. It brought to her the greatest sorrow she had ever felt. She sank to her bed, holding the envelope in her hand. She smelled it, stared at his familiar handwriting. She imagined him at his desk in his boys' quarters, near his small humming refrigerator, writing in that calm manner of his. She wanted to read the letter, but she could not get herself to open it. She put it on her table. She would read it in a week. She needed a week to gather her strength. She would reply, too, she told herself. She would tell him everything. But a week later, the letter still lay there. She placed a book on top of it, then another book, and one day it was swallowed beneath files and books. She would never read it. Taylor was easy, a childish child, the playful one who was sometimes so naive that Malu guiltily thought him stupid. But Morgan, only 3 years older, already wore the morning demeanor of a teenager. She read many grades above her level, was steeped in enrichment classes, and watched adults with a hooded gaze, as though privy to the darkness that lurked in their lives. At first, Malu disliked Morgan, responding to what she thought was Morgan's own disturbingly full-grown dislike. She was cool, sometimes even cold, to Morgan during her first weeks with them, determined not to indulge this spoiled silken child with a dusting of burgundy freckles on her nose, but she had come, with the passing months, to care for Morgan, an emotion she was careful not to show to Morgan. Instead she was firm and neutral, staring back when Morgan stared. Perhaps it was why Morgan did what Malu asked. She would do it coldly, indifferently, grudgingly, but she would do it. She routinely ignored her mother. And with her father, her brooding watchfulness sharpened into poison. Don would come home and sweep into the den, expecting that everything would stop because of him. And everything did stop, except for whatever Morgan was doing. Kimberly, fluttery and ardent, would ask how his day was, scrambling to please, as though she could not quite believe that he had again come home to her. Taylor would hurl himself into Don's arms. And Morgan would look up from the TV or a book or a game to watch him, as though she saw through him, while Don pretended not to squirm under her piercing eyes. Sometimes Malu wondered, was it Don? Was he cheating and had Morgan found out? Cheating was the first thing anyone would think of with a man like Don, with that lubricious aura of his. But he might be satisfied with suggestiveness alone. He would flirt outrageously but not do more, because an affair would require some effort and he was the kind of man who took but did not give. Malu thought often of that afternoon early in her babysitting. Kimberly was out, Taylor was playing and Morgan reading in the den. Suddenly, Morgan put down her book, calmly walked upstairs and ripped off the wallpaper in her room, pushed down her dresser, yanked off her bed covers, tore down the curtains, and was on her knees pulling and pulling and pulling at the strongly glued carpet when Malu ran in and stopped her. Morgan was like a small, steel robot, writhing to be let free, with a strength that frightened Malu. Perhaps the child would end up being a serial murderer, like those women on television crime documentaries, standing half naked on dark roads to lure truck drivers and then strangle them. When finally Malu let go, slowly loosening her grip on a quieted Morgan, Morgan went back downstairs to her book. Later, Kimberly, in tears, asked her, "Honey, please tell me what's wrong." And Morgan said, "I'm too old for all that pink stuff in my room." Now, Kimberly took Morgan twice a week to a therapist in Bala Cynwyd. Both she and Don were more tentative towards her, more cowering under her denouncing stare. When Morgan won an essay contest at school, Don came home with a present for her. Kimberly anxiously stood at the bottom of the stairs while Don went up to present the gift, wrapped in sparkly paper. He came down moments later. She wouldn't even look at it. She just got up and went into the bathroom and stayed there, he said. "I left it on the bed." "It's okay, honey, she'll come around," Kimberly said, hugging him, rubbing his back. Later, Kimberly, sotto voce, told Malu, "Morgan's really hard on him. He tries so hard and she won't let him in. She just won't. Morgan doesn't let anyone in," Malu said. Don needed to remember that Morgan, and not he, was the child. "She listens to you," Kimberly said, a little sadly. Malu wanted to say, "I don't give her too many choices," because she wished Kimberly would not be so sheer in her yieldingness, perhaps. Morgan just needed to feel that her mother could push back. Instead she said, "That's because I'm not her family. She doesn't love me and so she doesn't feel all these complicated things for me. I'm just a nuisance at best. I don't know what I'm doing wrong," Kimberly said. "It's a phase. It will pass, you'll see." She felt protective of Kimberly. She wanted to shield Kimberly. "The only person she really cares about is my cousin Kurt. She adores him. If we have family gatherings she'll brood unless Kurt is there. I'll see if he can come visit and talk to her." Laura had brought a magazine. "Look at this, Malu," she said. "It isn't Nigeria, but it's close. I know celebrities can be flighty but she seems to be doing good work." Malu and Kimberly looked at the page together. A thin white woman, smiling at the camera, holding a dark-skinned African baby in her arms, and all around her, little dark-skinned African children were spread out like a rug. Kimberly made a sound, a hum, as though she was unsure how to feel. "She's stunning too," Laura said. "Yes, she is," Malu said. "And she's just as skinny as the kids, only that her skinniness is by choice and theirs is not by choice." A pop of loud laughter burst out from Laura. "You are funny. I love how sassy you are." Kimberly did not laugh. Later, alone with Malu, she said, "I'm sorry Laura said that. I've never liked that word, sassy. It's the kind of word that's used for certain people and not for others." Malu shrugged and smiled and changed the subject. She did not understand why Laura looked up so much information about Nigeria, asking her about 419 scams, telling her how much money Nigerians in America sent back home every year. It was an aggressive, unaffectionate interest, strange indeed, to pay so much attention to something you did not like. Perhaps it was really about Kimberly, and Laura was in some distorted way aiming at her sister by saying things that would make Kimberly launch into apologies. It seemed too much work for too little gain, though. At first, Malu thought Kimberly's apologizing sweet, even if unnecessary, but she had begun to feel a flash of impatience, because Kimberly's repeated apologies were tinged with self-indulgence, as though she believed that she could, with apologies, smooth all the scalloped surfaces of the world. A few months into her babysitting, Kimberly asked her, "Would you consider living in? The basement is really a one-bedroom apartment with a private entrance. It would be rent-free, of course." Malu was already looking for a studio apartment, eager to leave her roommates now that she could afford to, and she did not want to be further enmeshed in the lives of the Turners, yet she considered saying yes because she heard a plea in Kimberly's voice. In the end, she decided she could not live with them. When she said no, Kimberly offered her the use of their spare car. "It'll make it much easier for you to get here after your classes. It's an old thing. We were going to give it away. I hope it doesn't stop you on the road," she said, as if the Honda, only a few years old, its body unmarked, could possibly stop on the road. "You really shouldn't trust me to take your car home. What if I don't come back one day?" Malu said. Kimberly laughed. "It's not worth very much. You do have an American license?" Laura asked. "I mean, you can drive legally in this country." "Of course she can, Laura," Kimberly said. "Why would she accept the car if she couldn't?" "I'm just checking," Laura said, as though Kimberly could not be depended upon to ask the necessary tough questions of non-American citizens. Malu watched them, so alike in their looks, and both unhappy people. But Kimberly's unhappiness was inward, unacknowledged, shielded by her desire for things to be as they should, and also by hope. She believed in other people's happiness because it meant that she, too, might one day have it. Laura's unhappiness was different, spiky. She wished that everyone around her were unhappy because she had convinced herself that she would always be. Yes, I have an American license, Ifmalu said, and then she began to talk about the safe driving course she had taken in Brooklyn before she got her license and how the instructor, a thin white man with matted hair the color of straw, had cheated. In the dark basement room full of foreigners, the entrance of which was an even darker flight of narrow stairs, the instructor had collected all the cash payments before he showed the safe driving film on the wall projector. From time to time, he made jokes that nobody understood and chuckled to himself. Ifmalu was a little suspicious of the film. How could a car driving so slowly have caused that amount of damage in an accident, leaving the driver's neck broken? Afterwards, he gave out the test questions. Ifmalu found them easy, quickly shading in the answers in pencil. A small South Asian man beside her, perhaps 50 years old, kept glancing over at her, his eyes pleading, while she pretended not to understand that he wanted her help. The instructor collected the papers, brought out a clay-colored eraser, and began to wipe out some of the answers into shade in others. Everybody passed. Many of them shook his hand, said, thank you, in a wide range of accents before they shuffled out. Now they could apply for American driver's licenses. Ifmalu told the story with a false openness, as though it was merely a curiosity for her, and not something she had chosen to go to Laura. It was a strange moment for me, because until then I thought nobody in America cheated, Ifmalu said. Kimberly said, oh my goodness. This happened in Brooklyn? Laura asked. Yes. Laura shrugged, as though to say that it would, of course, happen in Brooklyn but not in the America in which she lived. At issue was an orange. A round, flame-colored orange that Ifmalu had brought with her lunch, peeled and quartered and enclosed in a Ziploc bag. She ate it at the kitchen table, while Taylor sat nearby writing in his homework sheet. Would you like some, Taylor? She asked, and offered him a piece. Thanks, he said. He put it into his mouth. His face crumpled. It's bad. It's got stuff in it. Those are the seeds, she said, looking at what he had spat into his hand. The seeds. Yes, the orange seeds. Oranges don't have stuff in them. Yes, they do. Throw that in the trash, Taylor. I am going to put the learning video in for you. Oranges don't have stuff in them, he repeated. All his life, he had eaten oranges without seeds, oranges grown to look perfectly orange and to have faultless skin and no seeds, so at 8 years old he did not know that there was such a thing as an orange with seeds. He ran into the den to tell Morgan about it. She looked up from her book, raised a slow, bored hand, and tucked her red hair behind her ear. Of course oranges have seeds. Mom just buys the seedless variety. Ifmalu didn't get the right kind. She gave Ifmalu one of her accusatory glares. The orange is the right one for me, Morgan. I grew up eating orange with seeds, Ifmalu said, turning on the video. Okay. Morgan shrugged. With Kimberly she would have said nothing, only glowered. The doorbell rang. It had to be the carpet cleaner. Kimberly and Don were hosting a cocktail party fundraiser the next day, for a friend of theirs about whom Don had said, it's just an ego trip for him running for Congress, he won't even come close, and Ifmalu was surprised that he seemed to recognize the ego of others, while blinded in the fog of his own. She went to the door. A burly, red-faced man stood there, carrying cleaning equipment, something slung over his shoulder, something else that looked like a lawnmower propped at his feet. He stiffened when he saw her. First surprise flitted over his features, then it ossified to hostility. You need a carpet cleaned? He asked, as if he did not care, as if she could change her mind, as if he wanted her to change her mind. She looked at him, a taunt in her eyes, prolonging a moment loaded with assumptions. He thought she was a homeowner, and she was not what he had expected to see in this grand stone house with the white pillars. Yes, she said finally, suddenly tired. Mrs. Turner told me you were coming. It was like a conjurer's trick, the swift disappearance of